Now let's talk about who threatens the church. In the opening illustration, I talked about the defense systems around the capital of the United States and how they are looking out for their enemies. And I'm setting up polity as a means for Christ to protect the church and keep the enemies of the church from coming in, keeping those active agents of Satan from coming in and destroying the work that he is trying to do. So it would be helpful then to talk about who are these agents and how do they infiltrate the church and how do they use the power system to do that. Let's talk about it. There are essentially two types of agents Satan will use to destroy his church. The first is the false teacher. The first is the false teacher. Let's look at a verse here. 2 Peter 2:1. Peter warns the believers of the first century. But there were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies and bring on themselves swift destruction. Now, you could spend a month talking about this verse, and you could apply this in about 50,000 ways in the United States right now with the number of false teachers that we have. But let me just make a couple of brief points about this and connect this to how these types of men and women will use the power structure of the church to destroy it. First of all, I want you to see that he is connecting here, Peter's connecting false prophets with false teachers. Prophets at the very core are teachers. And so he's saying a false prophet that were called false prophets in the old days are now being referred to as false teachers. False teachers are false prophets. But he talks about their ways. He talks about them secretly bringing in destructive things. Secretly. This is the way people infiltrate the churches. This is the way the trouble begins. It is always in secret. And remember, I told you that it begins deep within the heart, the most secret place of all. And then it becomes moving on to other people. It's secret. It's secret. What do they bring in? They bring in heresies. False teachers bring in heresies. Now, the root word here means the act of taking captive. A heresy is something that a teacher uses, a false teaching, something that is not true, in order to try and win disciples, win people over to his or her side in order to accomplish some goal. The act of taking captive. These false teachings are deceitful, they deceive people, and then they come and they join up and they fight the God-given authority structures in the churches. The goal is to take away a group of believers. And that's always the way it happens. In all the churches I've ever seen, this is always the way it happens. Somebody starts bringing in a false teaching. And this is a destructive teaching. This is a fascinating word here. These heresies, these teachings, remember, teachings are nothing more than words and ideas. These words and ideas lead to destruction. And this word here means complete destruction, perishing, or ruin. And so you have to, when somebody is beginning to try and win disciples over to their side, and we're going to look at what a false teacher really looks like, and it's not necessarily what you think. When somebody starts to teach something and try and win people over to their side in order to resist the powers that are in the church and the work of the church, this leads to the destruction of the church. What is a split? What is a split? Is a split not destruction? If you've ever been through a split, you know it is destructive. It destroys you. It destroys the other people. It's a nightmare. It's destructive. And this is the word that's used about hell, destruction of hell. So it destroys the church, and it can also destroy individuals by leading them to being condemned for their activities, their actions. And here's our mistake when it comes to false teachers. The mistake that we make is to think that a false teacher only looks like this. We think that a false teacher only looks like this. And I know many of you know who this is here. This is Joel Osteen, and Joel Osteen is a false teacher. He does not teach the truth. He is leading people to destruction. But our mistake is to believe that false teachers only look like this. They're out front, they're on TV, they're standing in the pulpits, they're up front and for all to see. We think of the televangelist when we think of the false teacher, but that is not at all what most false teachers look like. Most false teachers look just like regular old Joes. In fact, most of the false teachers in Baptist churches today are not teachers at all. In other words, they're not preachers, they're not standing up in front of anyone. It's the little old lady in the nice white dress, the little old man in the overalls. These are the false teachers in most Baptist churches. You may remember when we talked last time, we talked about a man named Larry Hammett. Do you remember that? From Brunson and Kainer's book, Why Churches Die. You remember I read this, I believe I read this as the opening of the message the last time. In Why Churches Die, they talked about a guy named Larry Hammett, who was the guy who was never happy with anything. He never had any vote that he could support. And so he went to work when they were trying to get a building campaign going. He went to work to undermine what the pastor and the other leaders and the people wanted to do, and he was successful in that. But do you remember what it said about him? Let's look at this. Larry, this is Larry now. This isn't a preacher. This guy isn't up front. This guy's not on TV. Look at what he did. It says, first, Larry planted a measure of doubt in the minds of his Bible study class members. Larry felt he could sway them. He had done it before. He used his Bible study lesson to teach that stewardship was a judicious protection of God's provision. Rushing into anything that would unwisely use the precious resources that God gave us, he taught, was an abuse of His loving provision. Most false teachers in Baptist churches are not preachers. They never end up in the pulpit. But there is always some element of their work that is teaching. And it doesn't, in Larry's case, Larry was using his Bible study to teach the people something that was not true, to pervert the truth in order to take power. Now, Larry, too, like most false prophets and false teachers in the churches, was undoubtedly trying to use these arguments, these little teaching sessions with other people as he tried to grab power. He would grab them in the hallway of the church and try and explain to them what he was teaching in his Sunday school class. He would try and make his argument, or he would call someone on the phone and try and make his argument. You see, he is teaching. He is using destructive ideas to bring down the church. You cannot think that false prophets and false teachers in Baptist churches are only those in the pulpits, because they are not. There's a second class of people, and they're very much related. But there's a second class of people that threaten the church, and those are the dividers. Those are the dividers. Let's look at dividers. The Bible talks about dividers. Let's look at Ephesians 4:21. Paul says to reject a divisive man, one who separates, one who pits people against each other, one against another. Reject a divisive man after the first and second admonition. So there we have a divisive man. And then in Romans 16, Paul talks about it. He says, now I urge you, brethren, note those who cause divisions and offenses and avoid them. So we see here in both cases, these men and potentially women are dividing. They are causing divisions. They are causing the separation between parties within the church. And in 2 Timothy 2, Paul instructs the elders on how they are to deal with these kind of people. He says, and a servant of the Lord must correct those who are in opposition, so that they may escape the snare of the devil, having been taken captive by him to do his will. So what we have here is, we have, generally this is going to be, Satan is going to use the false teacher. The false teacher is someone who can speak, who can make arguments, who is trying to get people together and use them against someone else. This is a charismatic talker, an influencer, someone who can persuade people. And there's a subset of those people that are called divisive men. They're just divisive. They're not necessarily as charismatic, and they can't necessarily talk as well as the false teacher. But they are nevertheless driving division. We talked about complainers a couple of sessions ago, 1 or 2 sessions ago. Complainers fall into this. They're always upset about something, and they're always telling other people about them. And notice it says here that these people are taken captive by Satan to do his will. That means that people in the church can be taken captive by Satan. Now, what kind of a person is taken captive by Satan? An immature believer. That's why I spent 2 sessions talking about the sins of seniors, because these sins reflect a shallow faith, and a shallow person spiritually is going to be easily taken over by Satan, easily used to accomplish his ends. They're taken captive. And this is the divider right here. We talked about this the last time. This is the divider. The divider here is someone who's trying to use his influence to gain power. And see how it starts? Internal discontent, complaining, undermining, gathering support, public attack. These are dividers. So whether they can speak well or not, whether they have these powerful personalities or not, they are false teachers and dividers, and Christ is trying to protect us from them by setting the church up a certain way. Because what these folks ultimately do is manipulate the power system that we have created ourselves, that Christ didn't create, and use it to stop us from making those decisions to move the church forward, stop us from making those decisions to change. That's how they do it.